In the 15th century, the Great Horde, a Mongol empire that once controlled vast territories from Crimea to the banks of the Volga River, including the Russian principalities, started to weaken significantly. This decline was due to internal conflicts, power struggles within the Great Horde, and the emergence of splinter khanates such as the Nogai Khanate, the Kazan Khanate, and especially the Crimean Khanate alongside the Great Horde itself. With this fragmentation came a loosening of control over far-flung regions like the Rus principalities, which were practically abandoned by the central government. Although the remnants of the Golden Horde still existed as the Great Horde, its power had waned to the point where it was little more than a shadow of its former self. Under the leadership of Ahmed Khan, the Great Horde attempted to maintain control over its former territories, especially the Russian principalities. But these efforts proved increasingly difficult. Internal divisions made the Horde unstable, and this situation opened the door for other powers, especially Moscow, to begin to rise and gain autonomy. Moscow, in the 15th century, was a small principality among many Russian principalities. That means it was a vassal state to the Golden Horde as well, and paying the Khans homage and tribute. But it quickly grew into an important political and military center under the leadership of Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great. So, Ivan III, right? He really saw the writing on the wall with the Great Horde weakening. It was like a light bulb moment for him. He realized this was his chance to step up, consolidate power, and bring all those fragmented Russian principalities together under Moscow's banner. His whole approach was about centralizing authority and taking control of those lands that had been so divided before. But it wasn't just about political ambition for Ivan. He had a deep-rooted desire to free Russia from the so-called Mongol yoke. This wasn't just a financial burden for the Russian people. It had also created a deep wound in their national pride. The Mongol rule had lasted over 200 years, and Ivan was dead set on putting an end to that. His actions really set the stage for an independent and strong Russia, and that's why he's such a key figure in Russian history. People often say he laid the groundwork for what would become the Russian Empire later on. While Moscow was getting stronger, Casimir IV, the King of Poland-Lithuania, was also a major rival in the region. The Grand Duchy of Moscow and Lithuania had been at odds since the reign of Gediminas. Since the mid-14th century, Lithuania kept attacking Moscow, wreaking havoc and fighting over control of the lands that used to be part of Kievan Rus. Especially toward the end of the 14th century and into the 15th century, Moscow was eager to expand its influence in these territories and gain access to the Baltic Sea. This was a critical trade route that linked northern and central Europe with the eastern regions, making it easier to transport goods like timber, furs, grain, wax, and amber. For Moscow, expanding its influence over the Baltic wasn't just about economic gain. It was also about boosting its political power and prestige. This would allow Moscow to strengthen its position in European trade networks and compete directly with the powerful Polish-Lithuanian state at the time. On top of that, the relationship between these two powers worsened because of the attack by the Moscow sovereign on Veliki Novgorod in the 1470s, which had long-standing ties with the Polish-Lithuanian authorities. If Moscow continued to extend its power westward and invaded Lithuania's territories, Poland could lose rich resource areas like present-day Ukraine and Belarus. To tackle this situation, Casimir IV decided to ally with the Great Horde, even though they had a history of strong conflicts 1 year before. This alliance was an effort to counter Moscow's rise. Meanwhile, Moscow formed its own alliance with the Crimean Khanate, which was a strong neighbor of the Great Horde. They saw themselves as the rightful heirs of the Golden Horde and Kumania, referring to themselves as the Khans of the Great Horde, the Great State, and the throne of Crimea. This perspective led to continuous conflict with Ahmed Khan of the Great Horde. The conflicts between these powers stemmed from two main reasons. First, it was about territorial disputes. Both Khanates wanted to control the rich and strategically important lands around the Black Sea and the southern territories. This led to military conflicts and battles over trade routes and fertile resources. For instance, the trade route from Eastern Europe to the Mediterranean, or the trade routes across the Black Sea, included ports like Chersonesus, Kaffa, now Feodosia, and Taman, which the Crimean Khanate wanted to control to tax trade activities. The second reason for the conflict was the tribute system. The Crimean Khanate often attacked areas belonging to the Great Horde to collect tribute and slaves. This made conflicts more frequent and increased hostility between the two sides. So, the Crimean Khanate and Moscow shared a common enemy in the Great Horde, and this alliance gave both sides an advantage in dealing with the threat posed by Ahmad Khan. Their alliance complicated the power struggle in Eastern Europe. So, in that situation, Ahmad Khan decided it was time to make a move to show that the Great Horde still had some power by attacking Moscow back in 1472. He got his army together near the Oka River, around Alexine, with the goal of making Moscow pay tribute like all the other principalities had been doing under Mongol control for over 200 years. But here's the twist. The Moscow army, led by Ivan III, managed to push them back successfully. This defeat really hurt Ahmad Khan's reputation and made it super clear that Moscow was getting stronger and could actually stand up to the Mongols now. The tension kept building until 1476, when Ivan III made a groundbreaking decision to officially stop paying tribute to the Mongols in Sarai, while still keeping diplomatic ties with them. This was a huge turning point, because paying tribute had been a symbol of submission for the Russian principalities under Golden Horde rule for over 2 centuries. This decision really showed how determined Ivan was to break free from Mongol control and openly challenged Ahmad Khan. Ivan III no longer recognized Ahmad's authority and declared that Moscow wouldn't be a vassal of the Golden Horde anymore. This move meant that Ivan was ready to face the Mongols head-on, which made Ahmad furious. He desperately tried to get Ivan to acknowledge him as his overlord and quickly reached out to Poland-Lithuania to plan a strategy against Moscow. However, Ivan III didn't just face external threats. He had family drama too. By the end of 1479, his brothers, Andrei Bolshoi and Boris of Volotsk, were upset with his power centralization policies. Why? It was all because of the boyars' right to switch allegiance between princes that Ivan had enacted. Ivan III sought to centralize power in Moscow, allowing boyars to change allegiance only if they moved to his court. This limited the independence of other princes, including his brothers, who ruled their own lands, but felt increasingly controlled by Ivan. To add fuel to the fire, when their brother Yuri died, without children to be heir, Ivan claimed his lands for himself instead of sharing them with his brothers. This sparked internal conflicts, driving Andrei and Boris to secretly ally with Casimir IV of Poland-Lithuania in a bid to weaken Ivan's power. Sensing the cracks within Moscow, Ahmad Khan of the Great Horde saw an opportunity. He decided to strike, thinking this was the perfect moment to reassert his authority over Moscow. This all led to the famous 1480 standoff, one of the most significant moments in Russian history, when the armies of Ahmad Khan and Ivan III clashed. At the end of May, news of an impending invasion led by Ahmad Khan reached Moscow. Some people in the city suggested fleeing north to avoid the attack, but this idea was quickly dismissed. Instead, Ivan implemented timely defensive measures against the Tatar forces. At the start of Ahmad's invasion, there was already a network of defensive structures in place along the southern border of the Moscow state. This defense system included fortified cities, numerous ditches, and earthen ramparts. They utilized all the natural features that could provide protection, like valleys, swamps, lakes, and especially rivers. The main defense line along the southern border ran along the Oka River, which was known as the Oka Coastal Route. Ivan III made sure that protecting the Oka border was a priority. To defend this area, farmers were rotated into service, not just from nearby villages but also from farther away. During the Horde's invasions, these local militias would be the first line of defense, holding off the enemy at the border until the main forces could arrive. The military authorities under the Grand Duke had developed the principles of this defense line beforehand. To support the troops stationed in southern Ukraine, the Grand Duke sent a governor with armed forces to the Oka area in late May to early June. Ivan III's son, Ivan the Young, was stationed in Serpukhov. The brother of the Moscow prince, Andrei Menshoi, went to Tarusa to prepare the city for defense and organize resistance against the Tatars. A distant relative of Ivan III, Prince Vasily of Vere, also joined the campaign. The measures taken by the Grand Duke turned out to be quite timely. Soon, enemy patrols were spotted upstream along the Oka. Akhmat's army likely consisted of all the military forces available from the Great Horde at that time. Tatar invasions typically involved large armies, often numbering in the tens of thousands. Some sources suggest that the number of Tatars could be around 80,000 to 90,000. While this figure might not be exact, it gives a general idea of the scale of the invasion. The number of Moscow's troops isn't recorded, but it was definitely smaller than the 80,000 to 90,000 Tatar soldiers heading towards Moscow. Akhmat's army was on a rampage, pillaging Russian cities along the way to solve their supply issues. Back then, most armies, except for a few exceptions, had to provide their own food, often through direct raids on local civilians. The Ottoman Turks, for instance, were known for organizing centralized food supplies for their armies, a tactic borrowed from the Byzantines. In that system, the populations of conquered areas often didn't take part in resisting the invaders. Anyway, Akhmat kept destroying everything in his path. However, the timely deployment of Russian forces along their defensive lines prevented him from crossing the Oka River in its central area, which would have given the Horde the shortest route to Moscow. Akhmat aimed to move his troops toward the Lithuanian territories, where he thought he could achieve two goals. First, to unite with Casimir's regiments, and second, to launch an attack on Moscow's lands from Lithuania, without facing much trouble. So, Akhmat's army moved north between the upper reaches of the Don and Oka rivers, and, on an unknown date, set up camp at Vorotinsk, just south of the Ugra-Oka confluence, on the west bank of the Oka. They began waiting for the arrival of their Polish allies. But just like the Mongols had been abandoned at the historic Battle of Kulikovo a century earlier, the allies didn't arrive this time either. The difference this time was the intervention of the Crimean Khanate. The troops of Mengli Gire, Khan of the Crimean Khanate, under the alliance treaty between Crimea and the Grand Duchy of Moscow, attacked Podolia, a Russian land located along the Dniester and the southern Bug, and then part of Lithuania. This raid forced Casimir IV to abandon the war against the Duchy of Moscow. Akhmat's march along the Oka River was quickly spotted by Russian outposts. In response, the main forces were moved from Serpukhov and Tarusa westward to Kaluga and directly to the Ugra riverbank. Troops from various Russian cities, including forces from the Principality of Tver, were also sent to strengthen the Grand Duke's army. The Russian troops had the task of getting ahead of the Horde before they reached the Ugra River, taking and securing all the best crossing points. Akhmat's movement toward the Ugra posed some serious risks. Firstly, the Ugra wasn't as strong of a natural barrier as the Oka, so it would be easier for an army to cross. Secondly, getting closer to Moscow meant that Akhmat could quickly cross the Ugra and reach the capital in just 3 days on horseback. All of this forced the Moscow government to take urgent action. One major step was to hold a council. Ivan Young, along with his mother, his uncle, and many boyars, gathered to discuss the situation. They came up with a strategic plan to stop the Horde from invading Russian lands. First, they made an agreement with the rebellious brothers to end the fog of conflict among themselves. Stopping this feudal rebellion took away one of Akhmat and Casimir's key advantages. Next, they decided to put Moscow and several other cities on high alert. They partially evacuated the capital, sending Ivan III's wife, Grand Duchess Sofia, their young kids, and the state treasury to Beluzero. They also partially evacuated the people from the Pryoksky cities and strengthened the garrisons there with archers from Moscow. Ivan III ordered more military mobilization within the Moscow Principality. Lastly, they planned a raid by Russian troops into the Horde's territory as a distraction. To do this, they sent ships down the Volga, with the Crimean forces in charge. On October 3rd, the Grand Duke left Moscow to join the regiments protecting the left bank of the Ugra. When he got to the army, Ivan III stopped in Kremenets, which is between Maidan and Borovsky, and close to a battlefield where military activities could happen. This was a clever and strategic choice, because this spot was about 50 kilometers behind the deployed army along the Ugra, allowing central military leadership to communicate reliably with the main forces and giving them a way to protect the route back to Moscow if the Horde broke through the Russian defenses. Formally, the head of the Moscow army was Ivan Young, and his uncle, Andrei Menshoy, was there too. The main commander was Prince Daniel Kolmsky. Most of the troops were gathered in the Kaluga region, covering the mouth of the Ugra River. Russian regiments were also placed along the entire lower stretch of the river to stop the enemy from breaking through. During the defense along the Ugra, the infantry was in charge of guarding the fords and crossings, with fortifications built for that purpose. They set up permanent outposts with infantry and artillery at strategic points. The cavalry played a supporting role by patrolling and capturing enemy scouts. The main defense relied on infantry armed with firearms, including long-barreled guns close combat. The effective use of artillery was crucial, making the Ugra's position a strong point for the Russian forces. At that moment in Ugra, without his allies, Akhmat Khan faced a choice: retreat or fight the Russians on his own. He chose the second option, not knowing that what happened next would turn out to be a major historical event for Russia. The Battle of the Ugra River kicked off on October 8, 1480. The two sides were face-to-face, separated only by the calm Ugra River, which in some spots was about 120 to 140 meters wide. On the left bank, the Russian archers took their positions at the crossings and fords, backed by gunners with cannons and firearms. The battle stretched across the whole defensive line for nearly 4 days. The Russian commanders made great use of their guns, firing at the horde as they tried to cross the river. Despite Akhmat's repeated attempts to break through, the Russians held strong. Artillery, especially cannons firing iron and stone projectiles, caused real trouble for the horde. The Tatar cavalry, who were usually skilled with bows, found it tough in the water. They couldn't use their favorite tactic of mass archery, and became easy targets for the Russian riflemen. Even though Akhmat's forces were taking heavy losses, he kept ordering his cavalry to push forward. But every time they tried to cross the river, they were blocked. The Vologda Perm Chronicle even mentions that the horde couldn't gain a foothold on the shore. A new attempt was made by the horde to make settlements in the Opakova area. Here, the terrain conditions made it possible to secretly concentrate the cavalry on the Lithuanian coast, and then it was relatively easy to force the shallow river. However, the Russian armies closely followed the movement of the Tatars and skillfully maneuvered the regiments. As a result, at the crossing of the horde, they were met not by a small guard post, but by large forces that repelled Akhmat's last desperate attempt. The Russian army managed to stop the horde at the border and kept them from advancing towards Moscow. But the final turning point in the fight against Akhmat's invasion hadn't happened yet. The horde was still camped on the banks of the Ugra River, and they still had the strength to continue the battle. In this situation, Ivan III started diplomatic talks with Akhmat. While Akhmat was determined to keep the horde's control over Russia, Ivan III found this demand unacceptable. In the end, the negotiations didn't lead to anything. Maybe Akhmat was just trying to buy time, still hoping for help from his ally, Polish King and Grand Duke of Lithuania, Casimir IV. The horde cavalry couldn't attack Russian fortresses and cities on their own without Lithuanian infantry and artillery, just like any cavalry from other nations. With the talks failing, both sides spent the next month watching each other from across the river. It was late in the season, and both knew that once the river froze solid, it would become a weak spot for Moscow's defenses. Akhmat could gather his forces and break through the thin Russian defensive line at any moment. Because of this, Ivan made new tactical and operational decisions. His best plan was to pull back and regroup his forces. On October 26th, Ivan started moving his troops northeast from Ugra to Kremenets, and then further east to Borovsk. The area near Borovsk was ideal for a decisive battle if Akhmat tried to cross the Ugra. The city was located on the right bank of the Protva River, on hills with a good view of the surroundings. The forested terrain near Borovsk would make it hard for Akhmat to use his main strength, his large cavalry. Ivan had a strong defensive position to protect Moscow and could attack in any direction if Akhmat decided to advance. However, not only did Akhmat not try to cross the Ugra for a battle, but he also began retreating from the Russian border on November 6th. By November 11th, this news had reached Ivan III's camp. Akhmat's retreat route passed through cities like Mtsensk, Serensk, and then further on to the horde. During his retreat, Akhmat raided 12 Lithuanian towns. His son Murtaza also raided 2 villages in the Alexin area. But Ivan III ordered his men to march quickly and meet the enemy. When Murtaza learned that the prince's army was approaching, he also retreated. It was a strange sight, two armies running away from each other but no one chasing the other. Now, it's clear that these two retreats happened independently. Ivan's reasons were clear, but Akhmat's motives can only be guessed. Maybe it was because Casimir didn't show up, or because Ivan settled his argument with his brothers and added more troops. The approaching Russian winter was also a factor. If the standoff dragged on, Ivan could strengthen his army, while Akhmat had few reinforcements and they were far away. The Tatar horses and sheep they were herding were gradually exhausting the local food supply. There were also reports of disease in Akhmat's army, or another reason that he might have thought Ivan's retreat was just a trap to lure him into an ambush, a common tactic on the steppe. This marked the humiliating end of the Great Horde's final campaign against Russia. On December 28, 1480, Grand Duke Ivan III returned to Moscow, where he was joyfully welcomed by the townspeople. On the banks of the Oka and Ugra rivers, a decisive political victory had been won. The Horde's dominance, which had lasted for more than 2 centuries, was finally overthrown. Russia's struggle to free itself from the Horde's rule had been a brilliant success. The remnants of Akhmat's army fled back to the steppe. His rivals immediately seized the opportunity to move against the defeated Khan. This struggle ended with his death. In January 1481, in the Don steppes, Akhmat's forces, tired from their long and unsuccessful campaign, let their guard down and were overtaken by Nogai Khan Ivak. If the victory at the Battle of Kulikovo marked the beginning of a breakthrough in Russian-Horde relations, shifting from passive defense to active resistance against the Horde's rule, then the victory at the Ugra River symbolized the end of that rule and the full restoration of Russia's national sovereignty. This was the greatest event of the 15th century for Russia, and November 12, 1480, can be considered one of the most important days in the country's medieval history.